Let me tell you about a company that somehow convinced the world that renting office space wasn't really about renting office space. It was about community. It was about connection. It was about changing the way people worked. It was about elevating human consciousness. At least that was the story. And for a while, the story worked almost unbelievably well. WeWork didn't just open offices, it created a movement. It turned shared workspaces into a lifestyle. It made office space feel cool, flexible, modern, and somehow bigger than business. The hype grew, the press attention grew, the attention grew. The company expanded into city after city, building after building, country after country. Investors poured in hundreds of millions of dollars and eventually billions more, convinced that WeWork wasn't simply a real estate company. They believed it was the future of work. And at its peak, WeWork was valued at $47 billion. $47 billion for a company that, at its core, leased office space, made it look beautiful, and rented it back on more flexible terms. Then came the moment that was supposed to prove everything, the IPO. This was supposed to be WeWork's coronation, the moment when the vision, the growth, the hype, and the valuation were all validated by the public markets. Instead, the IPO became an autopsy, and a few years later, WeWork filed for bankruptcy. The company went from WeWork to WeBankrupt, and that's the story we're looking at today. Not just the fall of a company, not just the fall of a founder, but the danger of believing your own story so much that you stop asking whether the business underneath it actually works. Because in the end, WeWork's mission statement, to raise human consciousness, couldn't pay the rent. Now, to be fair, WeWork wasn't a bad idea. In fact, it was a pretty good idea. If you've ever started a company, worked in a small business, or even just tried to get something off the ground, you can understand the appeal. You don't always want to sign a 5-year lease or longer. You don't want to buy furniture. You don't want to deal with internet service, conference rooms, coffee machines, printers, utilities, janitorial services, and all the other headaches that come with having an office. You just want a place to work. And WeWork gave people exactly that. But WeWork didn't just sell office space. It sold a feeling. It sold belonging. It sold the idea that if you worked in one of their spaces, you weren't just renting a desk. You're part of something bigger. You were surrounded by other entrepreneurs, founders, freelancers, creatives, and people who were also trying to build something. And honestly, that part made perfect sense. Anyone who started a business knows the early days can be lonely. You're working from home or a coffee shop or maybe a small office that doesn't exactly inspire greatness. And then comes along WeWork with these beautiful spaces, good lighting, glass walls, modern furniture, coffee, conference rooms, and a bunch of other people who are also trying to build something. That is appealing. That's useful. That solves a real problem. But somewhere along the way, the story got much bigger than the business. WeWork's stated mission was to, quote, elevate the world's consciousness, unquote. That's a pretty big statement. That's not we provide flexible office space. That's not we make it easier for companies to rent an office. That's not we create shared work environments for startups and small businesses. No, this was much bigger. They were going to elevate the world's consciousness through office space. And at least for a while, people bought it. Investors bought it. The press bought it. Employees bought it. Customers bought it long enough to keep the whole thing moving, at least for some time. And Adam Neumann, the company's co-founder, became the face of this giant vision. He was charismatic. He was confident. He had that founder energy that can make people think they're looking into the future before the future actually exists. And that kind of energy can be powerful. Entrepreneurs need vision. They need confidence. They need to convince people to believe in something before it's fully proven. Every company starts with some version of a story. You're telling customers, employees, investors, and sometimes even yourself, this thing can work. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's a line, and WeWork crossed it. Because when the story gets too big and the founder gets too persuasive and the valuation gets too high, people sometimes stop asking boring but important questions. Questions like, are we actually making money? Do the numbers work? What happens if the economy slows down? What happens if customers leave? What happens if we sign long-term leases but our customers only commit short-term? Let's face it, those questions aren't very exciting. They don't make great headlines. They don't sound visionary. But those are the questions that determine whether a company survives. And that's really the WeWork story. It's not just a story about a charismatic founder. It's not even just a story about a failed IPO or a bankruptcy filing. It's a story about what happens when the narrative becomes more valuable than the business underneath it. And when that happens, reality eventually sends an invoice. Let's go back to the beginning. WeWork was founded in 2010 by Adam Newman and Miguel McKelvey. The basic idea was simple. They'd lease large office spaces, redesign them, make them beautiful, and then rent desks, offices, and memberships to people and companies who wanted flexibility. And again, that part was smart. For freelancers, startups, and small companies, WeWork took away a lot of the friction. You didn't have to negotiate a traditional lease. You didn't have to hire an office manager. You didn't have to build out a space. You could walk in and start working. For larger companies, it also had appeal. Maybe you needed temporary space for a project team. Maybe you were opening in a new city. Maybe you didn't want to commit to a large office footprint. WeWork gave companies options, and the spaces felt different. They didn't feel like old corporate offices. They felt modern, informal, energetic, and young. They felt like the physical version of startup culture. That was magic. But magic isn't the same as margin, and that's where the first big lesson comes in. The business model had built-in risk. WeWork would take on long-term lease obligations. In other words, it promised landlords it would pay rent for years into the future. But then it rented space to customers on shorter, more flexible terms. That creates a mismatch. WeWork had long-term commitments, but a lot of its revenue was based on short-term commitments. When everything's going well, that might look fine. The spaces are full, customers are happy, revenue is growing, investors are excited, you're opening more locations, and everyone thinks the model works well. But what happens if demand slows down? What happens if companies cut back? If people stop renewing memberships? If office space becomes less attractive? Well, the customers can leave WeWork much faster than WeWork can leave its leases. The landlord still expects payment. The buildings still have to be maintained. The employees still have to be paid. The debt doesn't magically go away. The obligations are still there. That is the hidden danger. And this is a reluctant lesson that applies to almost every business. You have to understand where the risk really lives. Sometimes the risk isn't obvious. Sometimes the risk is hiding inside your growth. Sometimes it's hiding in your fixed costs. Sometimes it's hiding inside customer concentrations. Sometimes it's hiding in debt. Sometimes it's hiding inside a contract you signed because everything looked great at that time. In WeWork's case, the risk lived in the gap between long-term commitments and short-term revenue. Now, that doesn't mean the business could never work. It means it had to be managed carefully. It needed discipline. It needed controlled expansion. It needed careful attention to occupancy rates, lease terms, cash flow, and market cycles. It needed leaders who understood they weren't just building a brand. They were managing a very real, very physical, very expensive real estate operation. But WeWork didn't grow carefully. It expanded aggressively. And when I say WeWork expanded aggressively, I don't just mean more offices. That would have been risky enough. But Adam Newman's vision kept getting bigger. At some point, WeWork wasn't just supposed to be a co-working company anymore. It became something called the We Company. The idea was WeWork would be only one piece of a much larger ecosystem. There was WeWork for where you worked. There was WeLive for where you lived. There was WeGrow for how your children would be educated. And there were even ideas floating around for other We businesses, because apparently, once you convince yourself you're not just renting desks, but elevating the world's consciousness, the possibilities start to look endless. And that's where hubris enters the story. Because this is part of the WeWork story where ambition starts to turn into something else. Ambition says, we have a good idea, let's grow it carefully. Hubris says, we have a good idea, therefore every idea we have must also be good. That is dangerous. Then came WeGrow, a private school connected to the same larger vision. And again, maybe there was an interesting idea buried in there somewhere. Education certainly needs innovation, housing can certainly be improved, work was certainly changing, but that's not the same as saying one company is qualified to reinvent it all. And that is a trap entrepreneurs can fall into. You have success in one area and suddenly you start believing your own instincts apply everywhere. You solve one problem and suddenly think you can solve every problem. You build one successful project and suddenly every adjacent idea feels obvious. But adjacent doesn't always mean relevant, and confidence doesn't always mean competence. In WeWork's case, the expansion into living, education, and broader lifestyle concepts made the company's mission feel even bigger. But it also made the company harder to understand. Was this an office company, a real estate company, a technology company, a lifestyle company, a school operator, a housing company? At some point, the vision became so broad that it almost stopped meaning anything. And while all of this was happening, new concerns about Adam Neumann weren't just about ambition, they were about judgment. There were reports that Neumann had cashed out hundreds of millions of dollars through stock sales and loans before WeWork's planned IPO. There were related party concerns, including properties connected to Neumann that WeWork leased. There was the unusual situation where the company paid millions for rights connected to the word we, involving an entity tied to Neumann. After much criticism, that payment was returned. And then there was the symbolism of excess, the private jet, the big spending, reports that Adam Neumann and his wife bought more than $80 million worth of homes while he was running WeWork. The larger-than-life founder image. The sense that the company was running less like a disciplined business and more like a movement built around one person's certainty. Now, to be clear, ambition itself wasn't the problem. Big companies often come from big ambition. The problem was ambition without enough restraint. The problem was the founder whose story had become so powerful that too many people stopped asking whether the company underneath the story could support it. And that's another reluctant lesson. Success in one lane doesn't give you permission to drive across every lane on the highway. WeWork had a real business. It had real customers. It had real market need. But instead of proving the core model with discipline, the company kept expanding the dream. Work, living, education, community, consciousness. It kept getting bigger and bigger until the story became too heavy for the business to carry. That's where Adam Neumann becomes central to this story. He wasn't just the CEO, he was the personality behind the company. He was the person selling the dream, and to his credit, he was very good at selling that dream. He convinced people that WeWork wasn't just a co-working company. It was the future of work. It was community. It was culture. It was human connection. It was a movement. It was the we generation. And that matters because in business, a compelling story can do a lot. A story can attract customers. A story can attract employees. A story can attract investors. A story can create momentum. But a story can also create blindness. Because when people fall in love with a story, they may overlook the numbers. They may excuse the losses. They may explain away the warning signs. They may say, this is just what hypergrowth looks like. Or you have to spend money to build a category. Or the old rules don't apply here. Now that phrase should make every entrepreneur nervous. The old rules don't apply here. Maybe sometimes they don't, but usually they do. Revenue still matters. Margins still matter. Cash still matters. Debt, governance, customers, and rent still matter. That's why the title of this episode is When the Mission Statement Couldn't Pay the Rent, because WeWork had a massive mission statement. But mission statements don't pay landlords. At some point, the business has to work. And this brings us to another lesson. Know what business you're actually in. WeWork wanted to be treated like a technology company. That was a big part of the valuation story. Technology companies can scale quickly. Software companies can often add customers without adding the same level of physical cost. That's one reason investors may value them so highly. But WeWork wasn't a software company. It used technology, sure. It had an app. It had data. It had a modern brand. But the core business was physical. It was buildings. It was leases. It was construction. It was furniture. It was utilities. It was maintenance. It was people. It was real estate. That doesn't make it a bad business, but it makes it a very different business. A software company can sell another subscription without building another office. WeWork couldn't. Every new location required capital. Every new location required a lease. Every new location required build-out. Every new location created more obligation. That's not software economics. That's real estate economics. And there's nothing wrong with real estate economics as long as you're honest about them. This is where a lot of companies get into trouble. They want the valuation of one kind of company while carrying the cost structure of another kind of company. A manufacturer can't pretend it has software margins. A restaurant can't pretend food costs and labor don't matter. A service company can't pretend people aren't central to delivery. And a co-working company can't pretend leases are some minor detail. WeWork's problem wasn't that it was in real estate. Its problem was that it wanted to be seen as something else. And for a while, investors allowed that. WeWork raised enormous amounts of money, especially from SoftBank, and capital can create a powerful illusion. When a company keeps raising money, it can look like validation. It can look like success. It can look like the smartest people in the room have already done the homework and decided the business works. But raising money doesn't mean the business works. It means someone believes it might work. And that's very different. And this is another reluctant lesson. Capital doesn't fix a business model. It just gives the business model more time to prove itself or more time to fail. Money can hide problems. It can make losses feel strategic. It can make overexpansion feel bold. It can make leadership feel untouchable. It can make a company look healthier than it really is, but eventually, money wants an answer. For WeWork, that answer was supposed to come in 2019 when the company prepared to go public. This should have been the big moment, the celebration, the proof, the moment when all the growth, all the storytelling, all the hype, and all the ambition were validated by the public markets. Instead, the IPO process became an autopsy. Once WeWork filed its paperwork, investors and analysts got a closer look at the company, and the more they looked, the more questions they had. The losses were huge, the lease obligations were huge, the governance raised questions, the related party transactions raised concerns, Adam Newman's level of control raised concerns, even the company's language raised eyebrows. It didn't read like a normal real estate company. It read like a company trying very hard to convince everyone that it was something much bigger. And the public markets weren't as willing to buy the story as the private markets had been. And that is an important point. Nothing about WeWork suddenly changed overnight. The offices were still there, the customers were still there, the brand was still there, the founder was still charismatic, the mission statement was still ambitious. What changed was visibility. The curtain was pulled back. And once people could see the business more clearly, the story started to fall apart. This happens in business all the time. Maybe not at the scale of WeWork, maybe not with a $47 billion valuation, maybe not with an IPO filing, but every company eventually has some version of this moment. A bank reviews your financials, a customer questions your capacity, a buyer does due diligence, a downturn exposes your cash flow. A key employee leaves and reveals how much knowledge was trapped in one person's head. A vendor changes its terms. A big customer walks away. Reality starts asking questions. And reality doesn't care about your pitch deck. For WeWork, reality asked some very uncomfortable questions. The IPO was postponed, then withdrawn. Adam Newman stepped down as CEO. SoftBank stepped in with a rescue package, and the valuation that had once reached $47 billion collapsed to a fraction of that. It was stunning. People had been watching what looked like a rocket ship. Then suddenly, they were watching wreckage. But here's where I think the story gets more useful. It's easy to make this all about Adam Neumann, and yes, his leadership, behavior, and control are major parts of the story. But if we stop there, we miss the bigger lesson. Because this wasn't just a founder problem, it was a governance problem. A strong board isn't supposed to be decorative. A strong board isn't supposed to just applaud the founder. A strong board isn't supposed to be so impressed by growth that it stops asking hard questions. Governance exists to protect the company. And sometimes that means protecting the company from the founder. That may sound harsh, but it's true. Founders can be incredibly valuable. They often have the original vision, the passion, the urgency, and the willingness to push through obstacles that other people would avoid. But those same traits can be dangerous. The confidence that helps launch a company can turn into arrogance. The speed that helps a company grow can turn into recklessness. The vision that inspires people can turn into a fantasy. And the persistence that helps a founder survive can turn into refusal to listen. That's why founders need truth tellers around them, not people who are negative, not people who kill every idea, not people who don't understand the vision, but people who are willing to ask the questions no one else wants to ask. Are we moving too fast? Are we spending too much? Are we confusing attention with traction? Are we confusing valuation with value? Are we building a company or are we building a myth? Those questions can be very uncomfortable, but they're necessary. Unchecked leadership isn't strength, it's vulnerability. A company built around one powerful personality can grow quickly, but it can also become fragile. If every major decision depends on one person's instincts, then the company is only as stable as that person's judgment. And if nobody can challenge the founder, the company has no immune system. Healthy businesses need friction. They need debate. They need financial discipline. They need people who can separate ambition from recklessness. That doesn't mean companies should become slow. It doesn't mean every decision needs to go through a committee. It doesn't mean entrepreneurs should lose their edge. It means speed needs guardrails. WeWork had speed. What it lacked was enough guardrails. After the failed IPO, WeWork tried to stabilize. It cut costs, it changed leadership, it pulled back from some of the excesses, and eventually it went public in 2021 through a SPAC. A SPAC is basically a shell company that's already public and then merges with a private company, allowing that private company to become public through a different path than a traditional IPO. So WeWork did eventually become a public company, but by then the original myth had been damaged. And the business still had the weight of earlier decisions. The company still had major lease obligations, it still had to manage expensive office space in major cities, and it still had to prove that the model could work profitably. Then the world changed. The pandemic accelerated remote work and hybrid work. Companies started rethinking how much space they needed. Some reduced their footprint. Some let leases expire. Some gave employees more flexibility. Now, in one sense, that could have helped WeWork. Flexible office space still had value. Companies that didn't want long leases might want exactly the kind of flexibility WeWork offered. But WeWork also had expensive leases of its own. It had obligations. It had locations that had to be filled. It had a business model that depended on occupancy. And the office market became much more difficult. In November 2023, WeWork filed for bankruptcy. That doesn't mean WeWork completely disappeared. Bankruptcy allowed the company to restructure, reduce debt, renegotiate leases, and continue in a smaller, more disciplined form. But the bankruptcy marked the final collapse of the original WeWork story. The dream of a $47 billion company changing the world through co-working had run into the hard math of rent, leases, debt, losses, governance, and market reality. So, what do we learn from this? First, a great product isn't the same as a great business model. That may be the biggest lesson. Customers liked WeWork. A lot of people genuinely enjoyed the spaces. The product solved a real problem. But customer enthusiasm doesn't automatically solve pricing, cost structure, cash flow, debt, lease obligations, or profitability. You can have a useful product wrapped inside a dangerous business model. That's a tough lesson because entrepreneurs often fall in love with customer enthusiasm. And to be fair, customer enthusiasm matters. You need people who want what you're selling, but it's not enough. The business has to work. Second, growth isn't always proof of success. While growth can be healthy, growth can also be a warning sign. If every new location, customer, product line, or expansion adds complexity faster than it adds profit, you may not be scaling success. You may be scaling your problems. And that's hard to see in the moment because business growth feels good. Growth creates energy. Growth gives people confidence. Growth makes it look like the business is working. But growth without discipline can become a trap. Third, know what business you're actually in. WeWork wanted to be valued like a technology company, but it carried the obligations of a real estate company. That mismatch created unrealistic expectations. Every entrepreneur needs to be honest about the economics of the business, not the business you wish you had, not the business investors want to believe you have, not the business that sounds better than the pitch deck, the business you actually have. Fourth, charisma isn't governance. A charismatic leader can attract talent, capital, attention, customers, and press, but charisma can also cause people to suspend judgment. The more persuasive the founder, the more important accountability becomes. A great founder still needs a strong board. A great founder still needs financial controls. A great founder still needs people who can say no. Fifth, capital isn't validation. Investments mean someone believes in the opportunity. It doesn't mean the business works. It doesn't mean the strategy is right. It doesn't mean the numbers are healthy. Money can accelerate a good business. It can also accelerate a bad one. And sixth, mission statements don't pay bills. Don't get me wrong. I believe in mission. I believe companies should stand for something. I believe people want to be part of work that has meaning. But mission has to connect to reality. A lofty mission can inspire people, sure, but it can't replace margin, controls, customer value, operational discipline, or cash flow. And it definitely can't pay the rent. That's the irony of WeWork. There was a real customer need. There was a real shift in how people wanted to work. Flexible office space wasn't a fantasy. Community wasn't meaningless. The product wasn't useless. But the company expanded too quickly, spent too freely, governed too loosely, and valued itself too aggressively. The idea had merit. The execution had problems. The valuation became detached from reality, and eventually, reality won. That's the reluctant lesson from WeWork. Ambition is good. Vision is important. Growth can be exciting. But every business, no matter how inspiring, no matter how well-funded, no matter how charismatic its founder, has to eventually answer the same basic questions. Does the business model work? Can the company make money? Can it survive stress? Can it operate without the founder's mythology? Can it grow without losing discipline? WeWork spent years selling the world a vision of the future of work. But in the end, its biggest lesson may be much older and much simpler. You can tell a big story, you can raise big money, you can build a big brand, you can create beautiful offices, you can get the press to pay attention, you can convince people they're part of something larger. But if the fundamentals don't work, the story won't save you. It will only make the fall more spectacular. If you enjoyed this episode of Reluctant Lessons where businesses go wrong, there's more coming because the pattern is always the same. Success leaves clues, but so does failure. We have many more Reluctant Lessons coming your way. As it turns out, there's no shortage. So be sure to subscribe to the Reluctant Entrepreneur Podcast so you don't miss an episode. And finally, remember this. Success leaves clues, but failure leaves lessons if you're willing to see them. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll see you again on the next Reluctant Lessons.